Good morning, everyone. We'll give everyone a second to join this morning, but I think we have a good group. I believe we've got 58 registered today, and they're looking forward to Robin's presentation. Let's see if we've got everyone in yet. Got about half have joined, so we'll give it another minute.
I see a lot of friendly names and faces in the
Yes.
audience. Very
We
nice.
appreciate everyone coming out for a Friday morning, but on a very timely topic. Give it just one more minute. Looks like we might have everyone who's join. Good morning. My name is Catherine Hecker. I am the chair of the nonprofit section this year, and we're delighted to have today be our first CLE of the year. And before I introduce Robin, our illustrious speaker, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. Some of these you may have gotten in an email I sent out like a couple weeks ago, but just in case we have anyone who missed that email, wanted to let you know of some things that the section is working on for this upcoming year. So first, we're planning to have another virtual CLE next month, November 15th at noon. So you'll see a link for that registration sometime in the next couple of weeks. And that topic will be on data privacy issues for nonprofits. That will be in conjunction with the privacy and technology section. So we're very excited about that. We are also planning on a January in-person CLE with a reception component, since we haven't been able to gather as a section since I think March 2020. So we're very much looking forward to being able to see each other in person again, and more details will go out about that once we've solidified the date and the times. Another area that we're working on is doing some pro bono work this year. And this will be in conjunction with the Georgia Lawyers for the Arts. They have asked us about staffing a clinic for their nonprofit clients. And our vice chair this year, Ballard Yelton, is going to be helping lead that. But if anyone has any interest in helping with that, either helping coordinate it or also just planning a volunteer, please feel free to reach out to us. I will put our email addresses in the chat box once I'm done. And then finally, we're also thinking about kind of creating a membership subcommittee for the section in terms of making sure we're doing appropriate outreach and finding people who would benefit from section membership. So again, if you have any interest in that, please let me know. So for the topic today, again, I'm delighted to have Robin Miller. She is the Senior Corporate Tax Counsel for Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, where she's been there for 14 years. And in that role, she acts as outside general counsel to over 250 nonprofits, provides corporate and tax legal advice to many of their nonprofit clients, and serves as a resource to the volunteer attorneys. She also manages 5 annual nonprofit legal checkups, which involve evaluating the legal health of approximately 60 nonprofits a year. She's a member of the TEGE IRS Joint Council, a member of the Atlanta Bar Tax Section Board, and at least very importantly, she is a past chair of the nonprofit section. So we are delighted to have her talk today about political campaign activities and electioneering. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Catherine. Before we get started, there is a question in the chat about the January session and whether there'll be a remote component to that. So I thought I'd throw that out there before I get started.
Thank you. That hasn't been determined at this time, but we will. We're planning to continue to have virtual, many virtual options, even if this one winds up not having a hybrid option. But we'll keep everybody posted. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining on a Friday morning. I do like my presentations to be interactive, so please put your questions in the chat. I will try and answer those questions as we go, and then if I answer the question and you have a further question, please unmute yourself and go ahead and just jump in and ask me the question. But let's start with the chat if that's possible. All right, oops, I jumped ahead. So let me first start by telling you a little bit about Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta for those of you that are not familiar. We provide free legal assistance to community-based nonprofits that have to serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals, and they are generally located in the greater Atlanta, really all of Georgia area. What we do is we match these organizations with volunteer attorneys from leading corporations and law firms who can assist them with their business law matters. So we're an opportunity for those who don't do litigation to assist nonprofits with their business law issues. We are always looking for additional volunteers. So if you're at all interested, our projects are really small projects. They average between 6 and 10 hours, and you can pick projects that are right in your area of expertise. So we have over 1,000 clients that we've served, and in 2021 we had over 1,000 matters for those clients. So we are quite busy, and appreciate any help that our volunteer lawyers can provide. So in order to be a client of ours, you do have to be an existing 501c3, like I said, serve or be located in the greater Atlanta, really all of Georgia area, and again, serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. We don't work with, very large organizations that have their own legal departments because they can afford to pay for legal services. But if it would impact the organization's ability to provide services, then we consider taking them on. I also want to mention, for those of you that do work in the nonprofit area, that we have thousands of resources on our website. We've been doing webcasts for 14 years every month, and those are all stored on our website and on our YouTube channel. We also have hundreds, if not thousands, of articles on our website. And 2 years ago, we began, or maybe even longer now, we began podcasts. And so please consider subscribing to our podcast through your regular podcast services. They're short, they're usually well less than half an hour, but they're little tidbits of information about various different topics that may be useful if you're advising nonprofits or you are a nonprofit. All right, of course, I have to give you a little legal information. I'm providing general guidance. I'm not answering specific legal questions. And of course, our information is copyrighted. So now let's jump in. So let's start with a little bit about the background, because as y'all probably know, there's different types of 501Cs. And different types of 501Cs can do different types of political activity or amounts of political activity. So I want to level set here. I also want to point out that when we're talking about political activities, we are talking about candidates, political parties, and elections. We are not talking about lobbying or advocacy or trying to pass any kind of legislation. So we do have webcasts on that subject and articles on those subjects on our website, but what we're focused on is political activities. So we're going to stay in that lane today. So 501c3 organizations, are the ones everyone's most familiar with, organizations that are organized and operated exclusively for an exempt purpose. And I've listed 4 of the very common types of 501c3s. But there's also 501c4s. And those are organizations that are operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare, promoting the common good and general welfare of people in the community. And those organizations have a different structure. You cannot take a tax deduction when you donate to them, but they allow some political activity. 527s are PACs. So their whole purpose is to directly or indirectly accept contributions or make expenditures for the function of attempting to influence the selection, nomination, election, appointment of an individual to a federal, state, or local office. So that is political activity, and that's almost entirely what they do. And the reason I bring this up is because there are some organizations that have related entities, one that's a C3, one that's a C4, one that's a 527, and they have certain separations, and we're not going to go into those details today about how to do those things. But just to note that you always have to look back at what kind of entity is it that we're dealing with. And what I'm going to stay and focus on today is C3s, which are the most restrictive, because when you give money to it, you can take a tax deduction, or in most cases, depending on your individual tax circumstances, but it is an available option. All right, so let's turn to political campaign activity for 501c3s. There is an absolute prohibition. So 501c3 organizations are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in a political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective public office. And those are all really important words that are included in this. So this is known as the Johnson Amendment, but it was actually an amendment to the 1954 Revenue Act. So this has been around for a long time. Now the words in parentheses were added in 1984, so they're newer. But in 1984, what happened was the United States Congress felt that that this prohibition was important and it should remain, and in fact, they needed to amend it. And I think that's something really to recognize as we move forward. In addition to sort of what's in the code section, the regulation, so 26 CFR 1.501C3-1B3 also talks about how an organization will not be recognized as a 501c3 if it's conducting these activities. Further, there's IRS General Counsel Memo 39694 that says that if you're operated in this way, you won't continue to have tax exempt status, and that in fact you'll lose it. So what happens if you do conduct political activity as a 501c3? One is loss of exemption is one option, and the other is excise taxes can be imposed. I'm not going to go into the details around those excise taxes, but just know that they can be significant. What I do want to spend a minute on is some of the words in here, particularly the definition of candidate. So at 26 CFR 1.501C3-1C3 Roman numeral 3, the definition says an individual who offers himself or is proposed by others as a contestant for elective office in a national, state, or local capacity. Does not matter. So this prohibition covers all candidates. And again, you can't participate in the campaign, intervene in the campaign, whether it's supportive or in opposition to. So now let's move into some of the more nitty-gritty. It's important to understand that any attempt to influence political campaigns is included. Also, what are those activities? Let's start to define what those activities are. And we're going to spend a decent amount of time now talking through what would be included. Well, it includes any contributions to candidates or PACs, which I just explained, participation in campaigns, making any public statements for or against candidates, supporting a political party, and there's many more activities, and we're going to drill down a little bit more into that. But basically, no money. You cannot, as a 501c3, spend money to support or oppose a candidate or on behalf of that candidate or for a political party. But influence is more than just money. Influence can be public statements. It can be other statements. And so you need to kind of really think through what it is that you do as a 501c3 or that your client may be doing as a 501c3 to see how they may be influencing an election. So a question that comes up a lot from my clients is, well, can I criticize a sitting elected official for something that they've done, some decision they've made? And the answer is, well, yes, a C3 can do that, but you need to be careful about when you do it. If you've never done that and suddenly you start doing that 3 months before an election and they're running for re-election, that's problematic. So it's a little tricky. The concept of an election cycle, we're going to talk about a little bit throughout the hour. And unfortunately, our election cycles used to be really pretty clearly 3 to 4 months. Now they seem to be never ending. And so that makes it a little more complex when you do things like criticize an elected official. I also want to point out that it doesn't have to be a direct criticism of something specific. So the 10th Circuit in Christian Eccles National Ministry versus US held that saying that a candidate is too liberal or too conservative can be enough of a violation. It doesn't have to be something very specific about their positions or their personal life or anything that we get into these days in political campaigns. So let's turn more specifically to public statements. And these can be verbal or written. And the IRS looks at a number of factors when considering whether these statements would constitute political campaign activity versus issue advocacy. And I will tell you that if you're getting into this area and really want to get into the details, make sure you read Revenue Ruling 2007-41 because it provides 21 very specific examples addressing political campaign activity. And it's a really good revenue ruling. So, when you're looking at this, you want to determine whether or not your statement identifies a candidate. And it doesn't have to be by name. It can be references that everyone's going to know who that candidate is. So you don't have to specifically identify the name. You see that a lot where there's sort of a reference and everyone knows who it is. So, does that public statement, verbal or written, have identify a candidate in some way? Whether that timing coincides with an election cycle. So are they making, a statement during an election period? And again, I've talked about that's a little hard to identify. Somebody just asked about the citations. You all should have received the written materials in addition to the PowerPoint, and all of the citations I'm referring to are all in those written materials. It's not very long, I think it's 7 or 8 pages, but there are written materials that supplement the PowerPoint. So the third thing that the IRS big picture will look at is whether or not that public statement targets voters in a particular election. So are they trying to get voters to pay attention in a particular election cycle? And in the public statement, they're identifying a candidate, it's in that time frame, and they're targeting voters. And then whether or not it identifies a candidate's position on something. So all of those combined, because if you're a 501c3 that has a position generally in certain areas, and you put out a public statement that says that candidate A, or the candidate that is, some reference to the candidate that makes it clear who that person is, and you send it out to a certain group of voters or to a certain geographic area and say that candidate supports this position, and everyone knows that you as an organization take a different position, then you're opposing that candidate. You're not actually coming out and saying we oppose that candidate, but effectively you are, and that's enough. The IRS also then considers individuals and their roles. So if you're an executive in a 501c3 or a leader of 501c3, you still have your First Amendment rights, but you got to be careful. Oftentimes you'll see a campaign ad in the newspaper where you'll see a whole bunch of people that are supporting a particular candidate. And a lot of times it'll have their titles after it. So it identifies what C3 organization they work for, if that's the case. Well, the important thing there is to make sure there's a very clear, large disclaimer that says titles and affiliations of each individual are provided for identification purposes only. Another common thing that we see where things go wrong is you've got an executive director, they've been working all day, they've been really busy, maybe meeting with people, they've got their name badge on, and they go to an event at the end of the day and it's a political campaign event for a candidate. They got to get that name tag off. That's really important. It's fine for them to be there as an individual, but you don't ever want it to appear that they're representing the organization. Another thing that comes up with some of our clients is, you've got those board members who have, or volunteers who've been volunteering for the 501c3 for a long time, and then they're running for office. So the candidate goes and gets a picture in front of the sign of the charity because they volunteer there and have for a long time. That's part of who they are and how they serve the community. Well, that's all fine for them, but it's not good for the charity because it looks like the charity is endorsing that candidate if they put that picture on their political campaign website. And we've actually had that. Or if they come to events and start shaking hands and campaigning at their events. So you have to be a little careful in those areas and be ready if somebody that is a longtime volunteer or is on your board is running for office to have that conversation with them around that and do it ahead of time so that you're addressing the issue before it explodes on you. You may also consider whether or not that person, if they're on your board of directors, should take a leave of absence during the 3 months leading up to the election from the board so that there's no entanglement. All right. Let's now turn to other impermissible activities, but we're going to turn more to your physical space. So for those of you that are 501c3s or who advise 501c3s, it's really important to think about the physical space and equipment and so on of that 501c3 and how it can be used or should not be used in conjunction with political activity. 501c3s should not provide office space or equipment or donor lists to political candidates. Now, I say that, but there's a huge caveat there. And that is, if this is something they normally do, if a 501c3 normally sells its donor lists, most of the ones I know don't, but if they did, and they sort of rent it, or they rent out their office space to individuals or businesses or whoever that wants to use the space, then they can do that with a political candidate. They just have to follow their traditional rules. And then they also have to take the time to offer it to all candidates. So they have to go out of their way to offer it to all candidates and then to document that they've done this. It's really important to make sure you keep a copy of those emails someplace very safe or letters or whatever it may be, and then that they keep the responses as well, so that they can show, look, we were even handed here. This is something we do. One asked, so we went out and made sure we offered it to everybody, and then we followed through on that. 501c3s cannot use work issued telephone number, email address, office address, or the organization's name when talking with candidates or participating in a political campaign, or the organization's social media. So drill down for a minute. You've got an employee who may be in their off time is working on a political campaign. Well, it needs to be made very clear to them. They cannot use their office telephone. They cannot use their office computer. They cannot use any anything that belongs to the organization in doing that. And they have to do it on their own time. They can't do it during the day while they're in their office, and period. So it truly has to be separate activity. And it's really important to make that really clear if you think that if you're working with a client who thinks that their employees are very politically active. You should also make sure there's no political signs at the office. You know, a lot people really feel that their cubicle or their office is theirs, but there should never be any kind of political signs or buttons. People shouldn't be wearing buttons, any of that. If employees use their vehicles to go places and to conduct their work, for instance, nurses, a lot of nurses, home health nurses that might be at a 501c3 are out and about all the time checking on people. If they should not have political sign or bumper sticker on their car. I know that seems a little extreme because it's their car, but if they're using it for business purposes, it's really important not to have that on there. Overall, it's really best to have a policy around this, particularly if your office has employees that are very politically engaged. There's nothing wrong with them being politically engaged at all. You just want to make sure that there's a separation between the 501c3 and the political activity. So the workplace basically is not a free country, as a lot of people like to talk about. There are First Amendment restrictions in the workplace that people need to understand, and that's permissible. Social media can get kind of tricky in this area. So a lot of people have personal social media, right? You have your own Instagram, your own Twitter feed, your own, as an individual, but I'm also an employee of this organization. And depending on how I use that, my feed and what I'm normally doing, if I'm often referring to work and the work that we do as a 501c3 is, then I do need to be really careful about not posting about political activity, because people will see that activity, even though it's mine, as really an extension of the organization. That's not to say that they can't set up another Twitter feed or another Instagram handle and then do that separately. But they do need to be really careful. You're not trying to tell them they can't do it. They just can't do it where it says, oh, I work for Charity A, right there on their information. And there needs to be some separation there, particularly if they're very active. Another issue that has come up on occasion is some of the 501c3s that we work with, on their website, they'll link to elected officials' websites, because some of the work that they do is to do that. It's related to their mission. In an election cycle, you have to be really careful about how and when you do that, in depending on the circumstances. But the organization, I recommend that you work with your clients to make sure that they consider those issues and consider whether they should keep up that link during an election cycle. And sometimes there's good reason to do that, but it's definitely a topic that should be discussed and considered. All right. Now, we've talked a lot about all the things that 501c3s can't do, but there are some things they can do. In some ways, they can get involved in political, sort of the political realm. But for me, it's really, think of it as civic engagement. It's not specific to a candidate or public office. This is about promoting democracy and encouraging voter turnout, and engaging in that. There's also, making sure that people understand where everybody stands on the issues. So we're going to walk through some of these different types of civic engagement activities. So voter registration, get out the vote drives, also voter education. So candidate forums, maybe voter guides or legislative scorecards. And the key here is, if the IRS finds evidence of bias that would either favor or oppose a candidate, a group of candidates, a political party, then it becomes prohibited political activity. So these are permissible, but only in certain ways. And I also will note that historically, there have been times where legislation has been introduced into Congress to not permit 501c3s to do any of this activity. None of those have passed. Nothing that I'm aware of has been introduced to Congress at this time, but historically that has happened. All right, let's start with, unless there's any questions on what I've covered so far, I'm going to go ahead and start with voter registration. So this first part is focused on the IRS. There's a whole nother component to voter registration that's all about state law. And I will tell you that I'm not going to talk about state law, but if you're interested in knowing what the laws are for voter registration, I highly encourage you to go to Secretary of State's website, as well as we have a webcast on our website that talks about voter registration that was done with the help of the Georgia Secretary of State's website. But there's a lot of rules and you have to follow them to a T. So if your client is engaging in voter registration, they definitely need to have a handbook. They need to be training their volunteers and employees in how to do it and how to do it correctly from a state perspective. Now I'm going to focus on sort of the IRS rules around voter registration. Of course, it has to be nonpartisan, right? So you have to make sure that any voter registration activities are not partisan in any way. Things you cannot do. You can't register only voters that are going to vote for a certain candidate or party. So I'm going to sort of back up for a second. All right, we're going to do, I'm a 501c3 and I'm going to do some voter registration. How am I going to do it? Am I going to set up a table somewhere? Am I going to go someplace and reach out and set up a table and then have people walking around and reaching out to people? Or are we going to do some canvassing door to door? Either way, you have to make sure that anybody that you interact with that wants to register can get registered. And you don't want to discourage anybody from doing that. So you want to make sure your clients understand that they have to register everybody that wants to be registered. So note, and you don't want to get into the issues either when you're doing voter registration. You have to be really like neutral party. I'm here, mostly Switzerland, right? I'm here just to do the civic duty of getting people registered. And not engaging, and there's some training that has to go into that, not engaging in the political campaign realm or discussing issues, legislative issues of any kind either. It's just about, are you registered? Do you know? Let's complete a registration. Have you moved? Do you need a new registration? That sort of thing. When you're deciding where to set up that table and where to canvass, you need to make sure that you're not doing a certain community because it's highly one political party or another, or because a certain candidate is likely to be favored in that community over another. So you really need to be much more open and in some ways less strategic, but focused on where are you registering people. You want to try and identify people that are unregistered, but you don't want to only target people that are unregistered in a political party. You can do some subgroup decision making. So 501c3s can focus on specific minority groups because that's tied to historic discrimination, such as race, gender, language, the poor or unemployed. Those are common areas to go for voter registration where a specific minority group lives or works, or it's a specific community. Like, for instance, in Atlanta, everyone knows that Clarkston is a big refugee community. There may be people who are citizens that live there now that come from other countries, and maybe they haven't registered to vote. You can also focus on subgroups that share common problems. So I listed farmers there. So, they may have similar issues, and there may be one candidate that's better than another based on those issues, but you can still focus on sort of the subgroup of farmers, because maybe it's very difficult to register people in rural areas. And so you can go out and do that, even though there may somehow be some tie to a candidate. But the most critical thing is to make sure that your client as a C3 is documenting their choices and their reasoning and how they're doing what they're doing when it comes to voter registration. That here's the areas we picked, here's how we picked them, here's why we picked them, here's the training and the handbook that we use, and how we make sure our people are doing their civic duty and not anything beyond that. And here's how we make sure they're aware of all the state laws as well. So it's really important to document that. It'll go a long way if there's ever an investigation into what you're doing. Any questions on voter registration? Because I'm going to turn to the next topic. All right. Get out the vote. So what does get out the vote consist of? It can be two kind of different things. One can be day of, taking people to the polls. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The other can be canvassing, doing tables, making sure people know, you have to register a certain amount of time before an election. But in the few weeks leading up to an election, you can decide to go door to door and tell people where their polling place is, make sure that they're registered. Perhaps they moved, and making sure that they know where to go. They might still be registered in their old polling place and they might have to drive there. The hours of the polling places. If they need to bring ID in Georgia, you have to have an ID, so you can tell them that. Also hours for early voting and dates for that, as well as regular voting. So that can all be presented. That's that sort of, here's the information to get out and vote. And then, of course, encourage people to do so. You can do this by setting up a table, talking to people sort of as they're walking through an area, or you can go to organizations can set up and go door to door. Now, two houses, one that has a sign for one candidate, another that has a sign for another candidate. It's pretty clear that this 501c3 is going to promote one candidate over another, they have to go to both houses. You cannot skip a house when you're doing these get out to vote initiatives because you don't like the candidate that's in their yard, this yard sign. You have to be very egalitarian and go to everyone, all houses, knock on all doors, and share the same information. Now, here's the hard part with this, because you knock on somebody's door and you go and you tell them about, oh, well, I'm here to talk about getting out to vote, making sure you're going to go and vote. Where's your polling place? Oh, you can even hand them a sample ballot. It has to be the sample ballot. It can't be like your version of it. That's limited. It has to be the entire sample ballot. You can hand them the sample ballot, which is a great idea. But they have to be trained not to engage in any kind of political activity. Because oftentimes, if you come to somebody's door and say all this, they might say, well, what do you think of this candidate? Or how are you voting? Or, well, what party are you with? So they have to be prepared not to engage in those discussions. Role play is really important before they go out, doing some real training so that as these people go out to do the get out the vote, they know how to easily get out of those situations without getting into a political discussion. And that's really critical because a lot of people will want to do that. And sometimes it's innocuous, but sometimes it's not. And everybody has a camera everywhere. There's a Ring doorbell and many, or other kind of doorbell that does video on a lot of front doors. And if you end up getting engaged in that kind of conversation and you're wearing your organization's name tag, they could submit that to the IRS and it would cause great problems. So it's really, really important to do that training. Then the other aspect of it is getting people to the polls. You can't limit who you take to only people that are going to vote for a certain candidate or party, obviously. You also can't limit it to people that are only going to vote for a certain issue. You have to do anybody and everybody. If you're going to, if you've got people going out to a community and they are canvassing about get out the vote, and then they say, well, we can also offer you a ride to the polls if you like it. You can't do that indiscriminately. You have to say that to everyone. Another key component is there can't be an enticement to get them to vote. So you can't say, oh, we'll go vote and then I'll take y'all to lunch. It's not permitted. And in fact, there's many more Georgia law restrictions. You're not allowed to give water or food while people are in line to vote at the polling places. And Georgia passed a pretty restrictive law all about these sorts of issues. So I'm not going to get into those details, but you should be aware that there are those restrictions. Any questions on getting out the vote? All right. Well, then let's turn to candidate forums and debates. So there's a revenue ruling, 66-256, that essentially said that an entity that's created to conduct such forums is a 501c3 if it does it correctly. If that's what its job is to conduct these forums in general for that state, maybe for the United States, maybe for a county or even a city, that they conduct these candidate forums or debates, and that's their job, and they run them. That is considered a civic duty, and they qualify for 501c3. This was clarified by Revenue Ruling 8695. And in that ruling, and this is important, they set out parameters that it must be educational focused. And so if you're working with a 501c3 that's engaging in these kinds of activities, you want to make sure they're meeting those parameters of 8695. In addition, there was a more recent revenue ruling, 2007-41, which I've mentioned a couple times now. And they set out a series of rules, and that's what is covered on this site or on this slide. You have to invite all legally qualified candidates. You can't leave anybody out. You have to track this. You have to document that you invited them. that you, if you didn't hear from them, that you reached out again and gave them every opportunity to participate. The questions in a candidate forum or debate must cover a broad range of issues. So if you're a 501c3 that's focused on environmental, you can't just ask questions about climate change and environmental issues. You have to do a broad range of issues. And that's really important. And the questions have to be presented by a nonpartisan, independent panel of experts, or a single moderator is fine as well. But that independent group or individual cannot comment on any of the answers or in some way imply approval or disapproval of their answers. And so they have to be very stoic, very focused on putting the question out there, letting people hear what the answer is from each candidate. Also, each candidate has to get equal time. They have to have equal opportunity to present their views. If you have ever watched a national debate for president, that becomes an issue where you'll see the moderator struggling to keep them within their time limits because that's an important part of what they're doing. So you have to have that moderator that's enforcing the rules of debate or the forum. So those are sort of the formal candidate forums or debates and the broad issues that need to be addressed. But a lot of times, organized 501c3s will invite candidates to speak at their facility. You often see churches or other religious organizations having them come to their services or at an event. And these are candidates running for office. So if you're going to do that, similar rules must be followed in the sense that you must invite every eligible and qualified, legally qualified candidate. You have to be unbiased about each one. You have to follow these same rules. You have to let them speak the same amount of time. You have to treat them exactly the same. And so you're essentially following these rules that are identified here on this slide, but just in a more personal capacity. It's not in the candidate forum debate arena, but it essentially is the same concepts and same rules that have to be followed. All right. Our last topic is legislative scorecards. We get a lot of questions on this. A lot of our clients want to put out a scorecard about their important issues and how the candidates fare in their issues. And there's two main revenue rulings. There's a precursor revenue ruling, 6771, on the subject. And that talks about evaluating the qualifications and then supporting a particular candidate. And if you do that, that's prohibited. So in your sort of scorecard, you're evaluating their qualifications, and then you're saying, look at all these qualifications, and we choose this candidate. That is completely prohibited, and that's what 6771 covers. But there's two rulings that really address specifically legislative scorecards or records, reporting on the records. And that's Revenue Ruling 78-248 and Revenue Ruling 80-282. And they basically say there are certain activities that are not prohibited that you can do. So you can annually distribute voting records of the current legislators or mayor or whoever it may be. So you can do an annual distribution of their voting records, but it has to be their complete voting record. It can't just be on the issues that are important to you, your organization, or the organization you represent. It has to be on the major. I mean, you have to cover absolutely every issue, but you want to cover all the major legislative issues, and that's really important. The publication can have no editorial opinion, so it's just literally here's what the topic was, here's what the vote was, and here's how they voted. So there's no commentary of any kind, and it can't be spun to make it clear that you would be opposed to somebody if the 501c3 is more issue oriented. It's really important to make sure that the content and structure don't imply any kind of approval or disapproval of the legislators. Keyword, unbiased. It should also not list who's up for reelection, because when you're talking about a record or giving these legislative scorecards, when you add that in, oh, and this person's up for reelection, it creates a whole different implication to the document. Now, if you're comparing somebody who's elected and somebody who's not, you're not going to have their legislative scorecard for somebody who's not, unless they're both from different districts and then they're running against each other. So that's something you got to look into and be careful. Revenue ruling 8282 sets out 9 factors, excuse me, that are pretty important when it comes to legislative scorecards. Again, the voting records of all incumbents must be included. Candidates for re-election cannot be identified. Excuse me. I've mentioned some of these already. You can't do a direct comparison of incumbents to other candidates. They also should say, because you're not going to include their entire voting record, it's important to say this is not their entire voting record, and encourage people to look at their entire voting record. It has to be widely distributed. And then the compilation is only distributed. Now, you can do a more limited view of a candidate that's for your membership. So if you have a membership, you're a membership organization, and you have people that support your efforts, within your membership, you can give them more limited information, and you can limit the different topics to a certain extent. But if you're doing it out to the public, you have to be much more broad. And those limited topics cannot be put out to the public, particularly in a legislation, in the time of an election cycle. All right. Other activities that should be prohibited, or that are not prohibited. So you can send a questionnaire, 501c3 can send a questionnaire to candidates on a wide variety of issues, but it can't be just the issues that are important to that C3, which is a question I get a lot. They're like, well, we just want to know about these 5 things. It's like, well, no, it has to be a broader issue, because the public knows where you stand on those issues. And so to only do those issues and then to publish that would identify whether you're in support or opposed to that candidate. So it really has to be a wide variety of issues. I've had some organizations, 501c3s, that will gather with a group of 501c3s in a community and together send out this more extensive questionnaire, because they have different topics that they're each interested in. And then together they get that really good response. And then they can put those responses in a voter guide and put that out there. And they can select issues based on what's important to the electorate, but it can't just be what's important to the organizations. So you have to look at your electorate to make that decision. And again, if you're going to do that, the organization needs to document really carefully how they made their decisions, how they chose these questions, and how they offered it or sent it out to all the eligible candidates to get the analysis and do it correctly, or all the current office holders. So some prohibited political activities is, again, a questionnaire that would contain evidence of bias on issues, a voter guide that focuses only on those issues important to the organization, and then a guide that emphasizes one area and its purpose is clearly not nonpartisan voter education. Because again, legislative scorecards are designed to be education-based, helping voters, doing that civic duty. Same with the candidate forums, right? The goal is that civic engagement, that duty to share who these candidates are, what they stand for, and how they voted, so that the public can then make a decision about, the voters can make a decision about who they're going to elect without any bias from the 501c3. An important thing that has come up before is candidates being asked to sign a pledge on an issue. And it's to support or oppose an issue. And there's organizations that'll have, we want you to sign this pledge and commit to these things, these 3 things related to their subject matter. And that constitutes political activity. So you need to be careful not to ask them to sign any pledges in support or opposition to some topic. And with that, I have some time left for questions, but that's the rest of my prepared remarks. So we'll open it up for any questions that people may have.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can use the chat feature, or you can unmute yourself to ask a question.
I guess I've answered everybody's questions on this subject. If you do have further questions, there is mobile voting on college campuses. I'm not sure what the question is. You can, if the county allows mobile voting and brings, and then has a polling place at the college, that's perfectly fine. Can you register people to vote on college campuses? Absolutely. That's a common thing historically, where you've got, students that are now living in a state and becoming essentially, that's their residence, and they don't want to, and they may not get the absentee ballot, and they may be able to prove that they are a resident of that state. They have changed their driver's license, have an address. They can vote, they can register to vote in that state. And there are it's notorious that a lot of college students don't register and vote because they have to get the absentee ballot, or they're registered, but they have to get the absentee ballot, and then they don't get it and don't follow through because it's extra work. And elections are in that season leading up to exams. Jody, did that answer your question, or do you have another follow-up? And you can just unmute if you'd like. Okay. Any other questions? No. If there's no other questions, if you do think of questions, know that you can go to our website. We have articles on each one of these topics, on legislative scorecards, get out the vote, as well as candidate forums. And then we do cover political campaign activities in general, and what you can and can't do. There's a question about level of IRS enforcement, and that's a really good question. In the last 5 or 6 years, there has not been a huge amount of enforcement that's been very public. But if someone videotapes someone violating this prohibition and it's submitted to the IRS, they will investigate, and they have an obligation to do so. Where we've seen less enforcement of this is really only in the church religious context. They're very wary of removing exemptions in that area, and have been. They used to, after every election cycle, there'd be a group of religious organizations that would lose their tax exempt status because there'd be an evidence of, the pastor or whoever, up on at the podium saying the wrong thing. But in the last 5 or 6 years, that hasn't happened very often, if at all. But other types, definitely, there has been a lot of enforcement. And I used to go to and deal with this at the National IRS office for clients on a regular basis who were accused of political activity. And it only takes one instance of political activity to lose your exemption. Sometimes they'll let you get away with those excise taxes, but more often than not, they're going for loss of exemption. And so they're pretty harsh around this area. It's not something to play around with, in my experience. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all very much for participating, and I hope you have a great, wonderful rest of your day.
Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude today's meeting. Thank you for joining and have a great day.
You.